Desperation breeds crazy courage. A skinny 14-year-old kid walked into a smoke-filled biker bar looking for honest work. He expected rejection. He expected ridicule. What he never saw coming was a thunderous roar of 40 Harley-Davidsons shaking his front porch, changing his family's destiny forever. Lowell, Massachusetts, in late November, is a city that forgets how to be warm. The wind howls off the Merrimack River, biting through thin jackets and rattling loose window panes in the cheaper apartment complexes. On the third floor of one of these crumbling brick buildings lived 14-year-old Leo Caldwell and his mother, Sarah. Their apartment smelled of bleach, stale radiator dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of sickness. Sarah had been battling severe renal failure for over 2 years. The dialysis treatments kept her alive, but they were a brutal, exhausting anchor that drained her energy and their bank account. Before the illness, she had worked double shifts at a diner on Middlesex Street, always making sure Leo had warm boots and a hot dinner. Now, she spent her days confined to a faded floral armchair, wrapped in layers of blankets, her skin pale and translucent. Leo was forced to grow up long before his time. He knew exactly which floorboards creaked. He knew how to water down the milk so it lasted until Thursday. He knew the precise tone of voice the landlord used when an eviction notice was imminent. And this week, that tone had turned from annoyed to definitive. They were 3 months behind on rent. The medical debt was a mountain they could not climb, and the state assistants barely covered Sarah's prescriptions. "I'm sorry, Leo," Sarah whispered, one Tuesday evening, her voice trembling as she stared at the pile of final notice envelopes on the chipped Formica kitchen table. "I never wanted you to have to worry about this. I'm trying to figure it out." "Don't worry, Mom," Leo lied, offering her a brave, practiced smile. "I've got a plan." He didn't have a plan. He had spent the last 3 weeks begging for under-the-table work. He had walked miles, knocking on the back doors of grocery stores, auto shops and restaurants. Every manager took one look at his scrawny frame, his oversized thrift store jacket, and his desperate eyes, and shook their heads. "Liability," they said. "Too young," they said. "Come back in a few years, kid." But a few years was a luxury the Caldwells didn't have. They didn't even have a few weeks. The landlord had given them until Friday to come up with $600, or the locks would be changed. By Wednesday afternoon, the cold was biting, and Leo's desperation had morphed into a reckless, quiet panic. He was walking down a grim industrial stretch of marginal roads near the city outskirts when he saw it, the Broken Spoke. It wasn't just a bar, it was a fortress. The exterior was painted matte black, the windows completely boarded up and covered in faded concert flyers. Out front, lined up with military precision, were a dozen gleaming, heavily customized Harley-Davidson motorcycles. This was the undisputed territory of the local Hells Angels chapter. Everyone in Lowell knew you didn't look at the Broken Spoke too long, you didn't park near it, and you certainly didn't walk through its heavy, steel-reinforced front door unless you wore their patch. Leo stood across the street, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He had heard the rumors. He knew the reputation of the men who drank inside. They were dangerous. They operated by their own set of rules. But as Leo looked at the massive, gleaming chrome engines of the bikes, another thought pushed its way to the forefront of his mind. They have money, and bikes need to be cleaned. His mother's coughing fit from that morning echoed in his ears. The image of the eviction notice burned in his mind. Fear was a luxury for people who had a warm bed to sleep in. Leo pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, took a deep breath that felt like swallowing ice, and crossed the street. The heavy oak door of the Broken Spoke swung open with a slow, ominous groan. The moment Leo stepped over the threshold, the atmosphere hit him like a physical blow. The air was thick, blue with cigarette smoke, and smelled heavily of stale beer, aged leather, and gasoline. Classic rock blared from a jukebox in the corner, but it couldn't entirely drown out the low, rumbling murmur of a dozen deep voices. Every head in the bar turned. The silence that fell was immediate and suffocating. A pool game in the back corner stopped midway through a shot. The bartender, a massive man with a thick beard and a scar running through his left eyebrow, paused with a rag halfway inside a pint glass. Seated at the bar and scattered across the worn booths were men who looked like they were carved from granite and bad intentions. They wore heavy leather cuts, the iconic Death Head logo emblazoned on their backs. Tattoos crawled up their necks and knuckles. Leo stood frozen by the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He suddenly felt incredibly small, acutely aware of his scuffed sneakers and his shaking hands. "You lost, kid?" the bartender growled, his voice like gravel grinding together. Before Leo could answer, a mountain of a man stepped out from the shadows near the pool tables. He stood 6'4", his arms corded with thick muscle and covered in faded ink. A heavy silver chain hung from his jeans, clinking softly as he approached. This was Silas Higgins, known to everyone on the street simply as Crow. "Ain't no candy store here, boy," Crow sneered, stepping into Leo's personal space. He smelled of whiskey and motor oil. "You got about 5 seconds to turn around and walk back out that door before I throw you through it." Leo swallowed hard. His knees felt like water, but he dug his fingernails into his palms to ground himself. I'm looking for a job," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat and tried again, louder. "I need a job." A few of the men chuckled. It was a dark, amused sound. "A job?" Crow laughed, looking back at the bar. "You hear that, John? Kid wants to join the payroll." From a large, circular booth in the darkest corner of the room, a figure leaned forward into the dim yellow light. The bar fell dead silent again. This was John Mackey. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but he exuded a terrifying, quiet authority. His eyes were cold, assessing, and sharp as flint. He was the president of the chapter, a man who had survived decades of turf wars and prison stints. Mackey took a slow drag from a cigar, exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, and gestured for Crow to step aside. "Bring him here," Mackey ordered quietly. Crow grabbed Leo by the back of his jacket and practically carried him to the booth, depositing him roughly on his feet in front of the club president. Several other high-ranking members, including a wiry man named Tommy Gallagher, leaned in to inspect the intruder. "You got some nerve walking in here, boy," Mackey said, his voice dangerously even. "What makes you think we got work for a kid who looks like a strong breeze would break him in half?" "I'm a hard worker," Leo said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact with Mackey, even as his insides twisted with terror. "I can sweep the floors. I can take out the trash. I can wash the bikes. I know how to polish chrome so it doesn't streak. I'll do it for half of what you'd pay anyone else. I need the money." Mackey studied him for a long, agonizing moment. "Why the desperation, kid? Where's your old man? Why ain't he out busting his knuckles for a paycheck?" The question felt like a punch to the gut. "He's dead," Leo said flatly. "Died when I was 3. It's just me and my mum, and she's sick, really sick. Her kidneys are failing. We're getting evicted on Friday if I don't come up with the rent, and we don't have enough for food. I'll do whatever you need done. Please." Tommy Gallagher shifted uncomfortably in his seat, exchanging a brief, unreadable glance with Crow. But Mackey's expression didn't soften. He took another drag of his cigar. "We ain't the Salvation Army, kid," Mackie said coldly. "We don't hand out charity, and we don't hire children to clean our bikes. It's bad for business." Tears of frustration pricked the corners of Leo's eyes, but he furiously blinked them away. He wouldn't cry in front of them. He had gambled his last shred of hope on this terrible place, and he had lost. "Fine," Leo snapped, a sudden spark of anger briefly overriding his fear. "Sorry to waste your time." He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Hold up." Mackie's voice cracked like a whip, halting Leo in his tracks. "What's your name, boy?" Leo looked over his shoulder. "Leo. Leo Caldwell." The silence in the bar seemed to deepen, stretching tight. Tommy Gallagher's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Crow stopped leaning against the pool table and stood up straight. John Mackie didn't move a muscle, but his eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He stared at Leo for a long time, chewing on the end of his cigar. "Caldwell," Mackie repeated softly, tasting the word. "Where do you live, Leo Caldwell?" 442 Elm Street, apartment 3B, Leo said, confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy. "Get out," Mackie ordered, his voice returning to a hard, dismissive bark. "And don't ever walk into this bar again." Crow immediately grabbed Leo by the collar and marched him to the front door, shoving him out onto the freezing sidewalk. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him, the deadbolt engaging with a loud clack. Leo stood in the biting wind, shivering violently. He had failed. He walked the 2 miles back to his apartment in a daze, the cold seeping into his bones. When he got home, his mother was asleep in her chair, breathing raggedly. Leo covered her with an extra blanket, went to his small room, and buried his face in his pillow. For the first time since his mother got sick, he cried himself to sleep, knowing that Friday would bring the end of their world. He didn't know that 3 miles away, inside the broken spoke, the jukebox had been unplugged, the doors had been locked, and John Mackie had called an emergency meeting at the long wooden table in the back. Thursday was a slow, agonizing crawl toward the executioner's block. The sky over Lowell remained a bruised, heavy, purple, threatening snow that never quite fell. Inside apartment 3B, the radiator clanked uselessly, offering noise but no heat. Leo spent the day packing their meager belongings into cardboard boxes he had salvaged from the alley behind the liquor store. He wrapped his mother's few remaining porcelain figurines in old newspaper, his hands moving mechanically, while his mind raced through 100 failed scenarios. There was no one left to call. No distant relatives, no secret savings account, no sudden miracle waiting in the mail. By the time the sun dipped below the industrial skyline, bathing the apartment in a cold, grey twilight, Leo felt something inside him finally fracture. It was the quiet, devastating realization that he had failed to protect the only person who mattered to him. Sarah watched him from her armchair, her eyes heavy with a mixture of immense love and profound guilt. "Leave the rest, Leo," she rasped, her breathing shallow. "Come sit. We'll go to the city shelter tomorrow. It's not the end of the world, as long as we're together." Leo nodded, though the lump in his throat prevented him from speaking. He sat on the floor beside her chair, resting his head against her arm, listening to the erratic thump of her failing heart. 3 miles away, the atmosphere inside the windowless back room of the Broken Spoke was charged with a different kind of electricity. The heavy oak table was surrounded by the chapter's fully patched members. The air was thick with tension as John Mackie stood at the head of the table, his knuckles resting on the scarred wood. "Caldwell," Mackie said, the name hanging in the stale air like a ghost. He looked around the table, his hard eyes locking onto the older members, the ones who had grey in their beards and old bullet scars under their leathers. You younger guys don't know the name, but Gallagher knows it. Bobby knows it. Tommy Gallagher, sitting to Mackie's right, slowly took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that looked suddenly weary. Arthur, Gallagher muttered reverently. It's Arthur's kid. Crow, leaning against the cinder block wall, crossed his massive arms. Who the hell is Arthur? Mackie sighed, a rare display of exhaustion from a man who never showed weakness. 12 years ago, before we owned this building, we ran our bikes out of a little independent garage on the south side. The mechanic there was a guy named Arthur Caldwell. He wasn't patched. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a hard-working family man who treated a motorcycle like it was a living, breathing thing. Mackie paused, staring down at the table, his mind dragging him back a decade. We were at war back then, with a syndicate pushing up from Boston. Nasty business. One night they tracked me and Tommy to Arthur's garage. We were unarmed, waiting on a transmission swap. 3 guys walked in with shotguns. They had me dead to rights, execution style. I didn't even have time to reach for a blade. The room was deathly quiet. Even the younger bikers, usually restless and full of bravado, leaned in to listen. Arthur was under a chassis, Mackie continued, his voice dropping an octave. He could have stayed there. He should have stayed there. But he slid out, grabbed a heavy steel torque wrench, and swung it at the shooter. He knocked the barrel away just as the gun went off. Mackie looked up, meeting Crow's eyes. The spread missed me. It caught Arthur square in the chest. He bled out on his own concrete floor, choking on his own blood, while Tommy and I handled the shooters. Arthur gave up his life, leaving behind a young wife and a toddler, so I could stand here today. A heavy, solemn silence blanketed the room. In the world of the Hells Angels, debts of blood and honor were absolute. They transcended time, law, and reason. We gave the widow, Sarah, a massive envelope of cash after the funeral, Gallagher chimed in, his voice rough. Told her to take the boy and get out of the neighborhood for her own safety. We kept our distance, so the syndicate wouldn't connect her to us. We thought she moved out of state. We thought she was set. Instead, she's 3 miles away, dying of kidney failure, Mackie snarled, a sudden fierce anger radiating from him. And Arthur Caldwell's boy just walked into my bar, shivering in a thrift store coat, begging to scrub toilets because he's getting thrown out on the street tomorrow. Mackie slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Get the treasurer, Mackie ordered, his eyes blazing. Empty the safe, and tell every patched member in the city to have their bikes fueled and lined up out front by 7 a.m. Nobody sleeps in tomorrow. Friday morning arrived with the biting chill of a true New England winter. Frost coated the windows of apartment 3B. At exactly 8 a.m., heavy, impatient footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by 3 sharp, aggressive raps on the door. Leo's stomach plummeted. He walked to the door and unlocked it. Standing in the hallway was Mr. Gable, the property manager. He was a tall, severe man in a cheap trench coat, clutching a clipboard and looking incredibly annoyed. Behind him stood 2 burly men, carrying heavy-duty trash bags. "Time's up, kid," Gable said, pushing past Leo without waiting for an invitation. He looked around the bleak, half-packed living room with profound distaste. "I told you, 8 a.m. sharp. The locksmith is on his way. You and your mother need to vacate the premises immediately." Sarah struggled to sit up in her chair, her breathing labored, panic flashing in her pale eyes. "Mr. Gable, please. Just a few more days. It's freezing outside. I'm waiting on a call from the State Assistance Office." "I don't care if you're waiting on a call from the President of the United States," Gable snapped coldly. "You're 3 months in arrears. This is a business, not a charity ward. Boys, Start putting their boxes in the hall." Leo felt a surge of blind, protective rage. He stepped between Gable and his mother, grabbing a heavy wooden baseball bat he had left leaning against the radiator. His hands were shaking, but his jaw was set. "Get out," Leo shouted, his voice cracking but loud. "Don't touch our stuff. Just give me until tonight." Gable laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. He gestured to the two men. "Grab the bat from the kid and get them out of here." The men took a step forward. Leo raised the bat, terrified but prepared to swing. Then the floorboards began to vibrate. It started as a low, distant hum, like an impending earthquake. Within seconds, the hum escalated into a deafening, guttural roar that rattled the frosted windows and vibrated through the soles of their shoes. It was a mechanical symphony of overwhelming power. Gable frowned, looking toward the window. The two movers froze. The noise was impossible to ignore. It sounded like a fleet of heavy bombers was landing directly on Elm Street. Leo backed up slowly toward the window, the bat still gripped in his hands, and peered through a gap in the blinds. His breath hitched. The entire street below was a sea of black leather and gleaming chrome. 40 Harley-Davidsons were arranged in a staggered, militaristic formation, entirely blocking traffic in both directions. The riders were cutting their engines in unison, creating a sudden, ringing silence that was somehow more intimidating than the roar had been. Neighbors were peering out from behind their curtains, terrified. Pedestrians on the sidewalk had completely vanished. Leo watched in stunned disbelief as John Mackey dismounted his custom road glide. Behind him, Crow, Tommy Gallagher, and a dozen other massive, heavily tattooed men climbed off their bikes. They didn't look up. They simply moved with grim, unified purpose toward the front doors of the apartment building. "What the hell is going on down there?" Gable muttered, suddenly looking very pale. A minute later, the hallway outside apartment 3B filled with the heavy thud of leather boots. The door, which had been left slightly ajar, was kicked open so hard it hit the drywall with a resounding crack. The two burly movers instantly backed away, pressing themselves against the wall. Gable stood frozen in the center of the room. John Mackey stepped into the apartment. He looked larger, more imposing in the cramped space than he had in the bar. Crow and Gallagher flanked him, their expressions murderous. 6 more bikers filled the hallway behind them, completely blocking the exit. Mackey's cold eyes scanned the room, taking in the packed boxes, the baseball bat in Leo's trembling hands, and finally, the frail woman in the armchair. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second before snapping to Gable. "You the landlord?" Mackey asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. I'm the property manager," Gable stammered, all his previous arrogance evaporating. He clutched his clipboard like a shield. "Listen, I don't want any trouble. This is a legal eviction." "Shut up," Crow growled, stepping forward. Gable immediately clamped his mouth shut. Mackey reached inside his leather cut and pulled out a thick, bound stack of $100 bills. He tossed it casually. The heavy stack hit Gable squarely in the chest, forcing him to catch it against his clipboard. "That's $10,000, Mackey said flatly. "That covers their back rent, and it covers their rent for the next 5 years. You don't evict them. You don't send them late notices. In fact, if the heat goes out in this apartment for more than 10 minutes, or if a single light bulb burns out in that hallway, I'm going to send Crow here to have a very personal conversation with you. Do we understand each other?" Gable stared at the stack of cash, his hands shaking violently. He looked at Mackey, then at Crow, who smiled a terrifying, toothy smile. Yes, sir. Absolutely understood." "Then get the hell out of my sight," Mackey ordered. Gable and his 2 men practically tripped over themselves, scrambling out the door, squeezing past the wall of leather-clad bikers in the hallway. Once they were gone, the tension in the room shifted. Mackie took off his leather gloves and walked slowly over to Sarah. He knelt beside her armchair, completely ignoring the grime on the floor. "Sarah," he said softly. Sarah stared at him, bewildered, clutching her blanket. Do I know you?" "You don't," Mackie said, "but I knew Arthur. I knew him very well." Sarah gasped, a tear slipping down her pale cheek. "Arthur, he saved my life, Sarah," Mackie said, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. 12 years ago, he took a bullet meant for me. I wouldn't be breathing if it wasn't for your husband. We thought you moved away. We didn't know you were struggling. If we had known, you would have never gone hungry for a single day." Leo slowly lowered the baseball bat, his mind spinning. The men he had terrified himself to meet yesterday were standing in his living room, treating his mother like royalty. Mackie stood up and turned to Leo. He walked over and firmly clamped a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "You've got your old man's grit, kid. Walking into the broken spoke took stones." Mackie looked him dead in the eye. "You asked for a job. You've got one. We run a legitimate custom shop on the east side. You start tomorrow. You'll sweep floors, wash bikes, and learn to turn a wrench the right way. We pay $20 an hour." Leo's eyes widened. "Really? But what about school?" "You stay in school," Mackie said sternly, pointing a finger at him. "You keep your grades up, or Crow kicks your ass. You work weekends and afternoons." Mackie looked back at Sarah. "And we've got a private doctor who handles things for the club. He's the best nephrologist in the state. He'll be here this afternoon to look at your charts. We're going to get you better care, Sarah." Leo dropped the bat. The crushing weight that had been sitting on his chest for 2 years finally lifted. He looked at the terrifying men filling his apartment, seeing past the tattoos and the leather, realizing they had brought him the one thing he had entirely run out of: hope. The roar of engines fading down Elm Street that morning was not a sound of intimidation, but a truly strange, thunderous lullaby. Leo Caldwell, a young boy pushed to the absolute brink, found salvation in the most dangerous men in the city. They didn't simply pay an overdue debt. They fiercely forged a brand new family. Sometimes the darkest shadows hide the fiercest protectors, and angels ride heavy steel motorcycles. 700 hardened outlaws stood in dead, suffocating silence. In the center of the dust-choked Mojave compound sat a paralyzed $2.5 million masterpiece. A 22-year-old runaway with grease-stained hands gripped a wrench, knowing one wrong turn of the titanium bolt wouldn't just strip the engine, it would cost him his life. The Mojave sun was a relentless, hammering anvil, baking the earth until the air above the asphalt rippled with heat distortion. It was high noon at the Iron Summit, a highly classified, heavily guarded desert compound owned by the most formidable chapter of the Hells Angels. Over 700 patched members from across the globe had descended upon the valley, their leather vests coated in a fine layer of white alkali dust. They were gathered for a single, defining event: the unveiling and inaugural ride of the Sovereign. The Sovereign wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a rolling monument, a mechanized bank vault, and an artifact of outlaw royalty. Commissioned 3 years prior by the chapter's ruthless president, Silas Montgomery, the bike had been the final masterpiece of the late Cole Briggs, a legendary custom fabricator who had taken his most fiercely guarded mechanical secrets to the grave. The Sovereign was appraised at an astronomical $2.5 million. Its frame was laced with raw, conflict-free diamonds embedded beneath layers of translucent candy apple red paint, and its engine block had been machined from a single, solid billet of weapons-grade titanium. It was a terrifyingly beautiful machine, engineered to produce a thunderous 250 horsepower. But right now, the most expensive motorcycle in outlaw history was nothing more than a lifeless paperweight. Silas Montgomery, a man whose reputation for violence was as legendary as the bike he straddled, turned the custom-milled ignition key. 700 bikers held their breath, waiting for the trademark, earth-shaking roar. Instead, there was a sickening, metallic crunch. It was the sound of internal devastation, followed by a high-pitched mechanical whine, and then a dead, absolute stall. A collective murmur rippled through the sea of leather and denim. Silas's face, usually carved from granite, contorted with a fury so dark it seemed to drop the ambient temperature of the desert. He slammed his fist against the titanium handlebars. "Dutch! Wyatt!" Silas roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Get out here! Now!" The crowd parted instantly as two of the club's most seasoned mechanics sprinted forward. Dutch, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, and Wyatt, younger but with a decade of experience under his belt, dropped to their knees on the burning tarmac. They ripped open their tool rolls, sweat pouring from their foreheads, stinging their eyes. They had precisely 10 minutes to find the problem before Silas's embarrassment turned into lethal retribution. 30 yards away, watching from the oppressive shadows of a corrugated steel supply shed, stood Leo Cassidy. Leo didn't belong here. He was 22, a runaway from the south side of Chicago, fleeing a disastrous $50,000 debt owed to a ruthless loan shark named Carmine Rossi. To save his late grandfather's failing auto shop, Leo had borrowed from the wrong people, lost everything, and hopped a freight train west. He had ended up stranded in the Mojave, taken in by the club solely to sweep floors, scrub oil pans, and take out the trash in exchange for a cot and a roof for where Rossi's enforcers couldn't find him. But Leo possessed a secret. He was a savant. Raised by a grandfather who built race engines for a living, Leo could diagnose a misfire by ear from a block away. He understood the heartbeat of a combustion engine better than he understood human beings. For the next 15 minutes, Leo watched in agonizing silence as Dutch and Wyatt tore off the Sovereign's primary cover, frantically checking spark plugs, fuel lines, and the electronic control unit. "The ECU is throwing ghost codes, boss," Dutch stammered, his hands trembling violently as he held a diagnostic scanner. "The fuel pump is priming, but the crank won't turn. It's completely seized. It's dead. Cole Briggs built this engine to outlast a nuclear strike," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. He stepped off the bike, unbuckling the heavy leather belt around his waist. "And you're telling me, in front of 700 of my brothers, that my $2.5 million bike is dead?" Wyatt took a step back, raising his hands. "Silas, we need a machine shop. We need an engine hoist. We can't fix this in the dirt." Silas wrapped the leather belt around his knuckles. The 700 bikers formed a tight, suffocating ring around the broken machine and the doomed mechanics. The tension was a physical weight pressing down on the compound. Leo couldn't watch anymore. He knew what they were missing. He had heard the specific pitch of that sickening crunch. It wasn't an electrical failure. It wasn't a seized piston. It was something far more insidious and far more delicate. Before his brain could process the suicidal nature of his actions, Leo stepped out of the shadows. "It's not seized," Leo's voice cracked. 700 heads turned. The silence that followed was absolute. Bear Miller, Silas's towering sergeant-at-arms, immediately stepped into Leo's path, placing a hand the size of a dinner plate firmly on the kid's chest. Bear was a terrifying mountain of a man, his arms covered in prison ink. "Get back to the scrap heap, boy," Bear growled, his eyes narrowing, "before I snap your neck." "Let him speak." Silas's voice cut through the heavy air. He walked slowly toward Leo, his icy blue eyes analyzing the scrawny, grease-stained runaway. "You know something my head mechanics don't, trash boy?" "They're looking at the electronics and the fuel delivery," Leo said, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "But when you turned the key, the starter motor whined at a high frequency before the crunch. The crank isn't seized. The engine is out of time. Your timing chain tensioner collapsed, and the gears locked up to prevent the valves from smashing into the pistons." Dutch scoffed from the ground. "That's impossible. Briggs used a custom pneumatic tensioner on this build. It doesn't just collapse." "No," Leo said, stepping past Bear and approaching the legendary motorcycle. "It doesn't just collapse, unless someone messed with the internal shim." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. The word sabotage hung in the sweltering air, unspoken but heavily implied. Silas stared at Leo for a long, agonizing moment. Then he looked at his gold Rolex. "You have exactly 20 minutes. If this bike fires up, I'll give you $10,000 in cash right now. If it doesn't, Bear is going to drag you out into the dunes, and nobody is ever going to see you again." Leo swallowed hard. He had 20 minutes to perform open-heart surgery on a masterpiece, surrounded by outlaws who would gladly watch him die. He dropped to his knees in the burning dust, shoving Dutch and Wyatt's tools aside. He didn't need a diagnostic computer. He needed feelers, a micrometer, and a socket set. Leo's hands, previously trembling, suddenly became steady the moment they touched cold metal. This was his sanctuary. He rapidly unbolted the timing cover, catching the dripping synthetic oil in a rag. As he pulled the titanium cover away, the intricate, clockwork guts of Cole Briggs's masterpiece were exposed to the desert sun. Leo leaned in closely, squinting against the glare. He reached his slender fingers into the oily abyss, navigating past the razor-sharp edges of the timing chain. He found the pneumatic tensioner. Just as he suspected, the primary locking pin was completely disengaged, but as he pulled the tensioner assembly out to inspect it, his blood ran cold. The microscopic metal shim, a tiny ring designed to keep the tensioner aligned, had been installed backwards, and it wasn't a factory defect. The edges of the shim were scarred, indicating it had been intentionally reversed recently. Someone inside the club had deliberately rigged the $2.5 million motorcycle to destroy itself the moment Silas tried to start it, in front of the entire assembly. Leo's mind raced. If he mentioned the sabotage aloud right now, a bloodbath would erupt. Paranoia would take over, and he, the outsider with his hands inside the engine, would likely be the first casualty. He had to fix it, keep his mouth shut, and survive the next 10 minutes. 10 minutes, kid, Bear sneered from above him, casting a long, dark shadow over the bike. "I need a hand file," Leo demanded, his voice surprisingly firm. "A fine-toothed diamond file, now." Wyatt scrambled to his toolbox and handed Leo the file. The original shim was warped beyond use. Leo dug frantically through a nearby coffee can of scrap bolts and washers that Dutch kept on his cart. He found a hardened steel washer that was roughly the same diameter. Right there, on the burning asphalt, kneeling in front of 700 silent outlaws, Leo Cassidy began to machine a custom engine, part by hand. The rhythmic shh, shh, shh of the diamond file against the steel washer was the only sound in the compound. Leo worked purely by muscle memory and spatial instinct. He filed the metal down, creating the exact bevel needed to mimic Cole Briggs's engineered design. He would check it with his micrometer, file again, check again. He was working to tolerances of thousandths of an inch, using nothing but his bare hands and raw talent. "Time's up," Silas announced, his voice cold and devoid of mercy. "Done," Leo breathed out. He slipped the newly fashioned steel shim into the tensioner housing, making sure the alignment was absolutely flawless. He compressed the pneumatic cylinder, locked the timing chain perfectly into place, and bolted the heavy titanium side cover back onto the engine block. He stood up, wiping his black, oily hands on his jeans. He backed away from the motorcycle. "Turn the key," Leo whispered. Silas Montgomery stepped over to the Sovereign. He looked at Leo, then at the gathered masses of his empire. He reached out and turned the custom ignition key. Click. He pressed the heavy steel starter button. For a fraction of a second, the starter whined. And then, the Mojave Desert violently shook. The Sovereign detonated into life. A deafening, flawless, ground-trembling roar ripped from the custom exhaust pipes, echoing like heavy artillery off the distant mountains. The titanium engine idled perfectly, a menacing, rhythmic thumping that vibrated in the chests of every man standing there. The $2.5 million machine was alive. The tension snapped. 700 bikers erupted into a chaotic symphony of cheers, howling and revving their own engines in a thunderous salute. Silas Montgomery threw his head back and laughed, a rare, terrifying sound. He reached into his leather cut, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, and shoved them hard into Leo's chest. "You're a goddamn wizard, kid," Silas yelled over the roar of the engine. "You belong to me now." As the crowd surged forward to admire the idling machine, Leo staggered backward, his knees weak from the adrenaline crash. He retreated to the shadows of the supply shed, clutching the $10,000 in cash. He had survived. He had actually done it. But as the cheers roared outside, Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out the original, warped shim he had removed from the engine. In the privacy of the dark shed, he wiped the oil off the tiny ring of metal. He held it up to the sliver of sunlight piercing through the corrugated roof. There, etched meticulously into the side of the tampered metal, was a microscopic maker's mark. It was a crude, tiny engraving of a bare paw. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He looked up through the dusty window of the shed. Outside, standing right behind Silas Montgomery, was Bear Miller. And Bear wasn't looking at the motorcycle. Bear was staring directly at the supply shed, his eyes locked onto the window, a look of murderous realization crossing his face. Bear knew that Leo had seen the shim. Leo hadn't just fixed a motorcycle. He had just stumbled into an assassination plot against the most dangerous man in Nevada. And the executioner knew he had the evidence. The Iron Summit compound transformed with terrifying speed from a tense arena into a chaotic, dust-choked carnival. The thunderous idol of the Sovereign had acted as a starting pistol. High-octane fuel fumes mixed with the thick, greasy smoke of roasting hogs on massive spit roasters. 700 outlaws celebrated the resurrection of Cole Briggs's masterpiece, passing bottles of cheap bourbon and roaring over the heavy metal music that now blasted from towering PA speakers. Inside the suffocating heat of the corrugated steel supply shed, Leo Cassidy wasn't celebrating. He was a trapped animal, hyperventilating in the dark. He clutched the $10,000 in one hand and the sabotaged steel shim in the other. Through the grime-caked window, he watched Bear Miller. The towering sergeant-at-arms had broken away from Silas Montgomery's inner circle and was currently shoving his way through the sea of leather-clad bodies, his dark eyes locked onto the shed. Bear's path was deliberate, his massive shoulders parting the crowd like a dreadnought cutting through rough seas. Leo had exactly 30 seconds before the deadliest man in the Mojave Desert stepped through that door. Survival instinct, honed on the unforgiving south side of Chicago, overrode Leo's panic. He couldn't fight a man who had survived 3 stints in maximum security. He had to outthink him. Leo grabbed a rusted coffee can full of degreaser and violently shoved the $10,000 in cash deep to the bottom, plunging his hands into the toxic-smelling sludge to hide the bills beneath a layer of soaking wet shop rags. He then grabbed a heavy, forged steel snap-on wrench, his knuckles white, and backed into the darkest corner of the shed, right beside a stack of empty oil drums. The tin door groaned open. The heavy bass from the party outside momentarily flooded the room before the door swung shut, plunging the shed back into a dim, suffocating twilight. Bear Miller stood in the doorway. He didn't say a word at first. The silence was heavier than the desert heat. He slowly pulled a custom, serrated buck knife from a leather sheath on his belt. The metallic shook of the blade being drawn made the hairs on Leo's arms stand up. "You got lucky out there, kid," Bear said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the muffled music outside. "Lucky you found that timing issue. Lucky my president is in a generous mood." Leo swallowed the lump of terror in his throat, gripping the wrench tighter behind his leg. "Just doing the job I was told to do." Bear took a slow, heavy step forward. The floorboards creaked under his massive weight. "You have good eyes. Too good. A kid who sees things he shouldn't. Well, out here in the desert, those kinds of kids tend to have short lifespans. They wander off into the alkali flats, and the coyotes scatter their bones." Bear stopped 3 feet away. The smell of stale whiskey, chewing tobacco, and raw aggression radiated from him. "Hand it over," Bear whispered, holding out his massive, calloused palm. "Give me the scrap metal you pulled from the tensioner housing, and maybe I'll let you walk out the front gate tonight." Leo's mind raced. If he handed over the shim with the bear paw engraving, he gave up his only leverage. Bear would slit his throat the second the evidence was secured, bury him out back, and tell Silas the runaway had stolen a motorcycle and bolted with the cash. "I threw it in the scrap bucket on Dutch's cart," Leo lied, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. "It was warped. It's trash." Bear's eyes narrowed into slits. He lunged, his massive hand snapping forward with the speed of a striking rattlesnake. He grabbed Leo by the throat, slamming the 22-year-old mechanic against the corrugated tin wall with bone-jarring force. The heavy wrench clattered to the floor. Leo gagged, his feet dangling 2 inches off the ground as Bear's grip crushed his windpipe. "Don't lie to me, you little rat," Bear hissed, pressing the cold, serrated edge of the buck knife against Leo's ribs. "I saw you pocket it. I know you looked at it. You think Silas is going to believe a homeless drifter over his own blood brother? I'll gut you right here and say I caught you stealing parts." Black spots danced in Leo's vision. He was losing oxygen fast. His hands scrabbled desperately against the steel wall, searching for anything. His right hand knocked against a pressurized canister of commercial-grade carburetor cleaner sitting on a shelf. With his last ounce of conscious strength, Leo grabbed the aerosol can, shoved the nozzle directly into Bear's face, and pressed the trigger. A high-pressure stream of toxic, highly flammable acetone blasted directly into Bear's eyes. The giant roared in agonizing pain, dropping Leo and clawing furiously at his own face. The knife clattered against the oil drums. Leo hit the floor, gasping violently for air. He didn't waste a millisecond. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed the rusted coffee can containing the money from the workbench, and bolted out the door into the blinding, chaotic glare of the compound. Leo hit the crowd running. He kept his head down, weaving frantically between the throngs of intoxicated bikers, dodging roaring fire pits and revving motorcycles. He knew Bear would be blind for only a few minutes. Once the enforcer flushed his eyes, a brutal, organized hunt would begin. The front gates were heavily guarded by Bear's loyal prospects. Leaving via the main road was a death sentence. Leo's only chance lay at the northern edge of the compound, the boneyard. It was a sprawling, fenced-in acreage where the club dumped wrecked frames, blown engines, and stolen vehicles stripped for parts. For the past 3 weeks, under the guise of organizing scrap, Leo had been quietly cannibalizing parts to rebuild a wrecked 1998 Yamaha YZ250 dirt bike he had found buried under a pile of rusted fenders. It wasn't a $2.5 million masterpiece, but it was light, aggressive, and possessed a suspension built to absorb the punishing Mojave terrain. As Leo sprinted toward the boneyard, he realized something terrifying. Escaping wasn't enough. Bear was a high-ranking officer in a global syndicate. With his connections, Bear could track Leo down anywhere in the country. To truly survive, Leo had to destroy Bear from the inside. He needed Silas to know the truth. Suddenly, Leo saw Dutch. The head mechanic was standing near a keg, laughing with 2 other patched members, his heavy leather cut hanging open. Leo made a split-second decision. He altered his trajectory, deliberately stumbling hard into Dutch, spilling the mechanic's beer all over the dirt. "Watch it, you little punk!" Dutch barked, shoving Leo backward. Sorry, man, someone pushed me," Leo stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. But in the brief second of the collision, Leo's sleight of hand, perfected from years of surviving the streets, went to work. He slipped the sabotaged steel shim, wrapped tightly in a greasy scrap of paper, directly into the deep breast pocket of Dutch's leather vest. On the paper, Leo had frantically scrawled 3 words with a grease pencil. "Look at it." Dutch waved him off in disgust. Leo turned and vanished into the shadows, sprinting toward the rusted chain-link fence of the boneyard. He knew Dutch's obsessive mechanical mind. When Dutch found a random engine part in his pocket, he wouldn't throw it away. He would inspect it under a magnifying glass. He would see the bare paw engraving, and he would take it straight to Silas. Leo reached the back corner of the boneyard. Hidden beneath a ratty, sun-bleached tarp was the Yamaha YZ250. He ripped the tarp away. He fished the dripping, solvent-soaked stacks of $100 bills out of the coffee can and shoved them into his jacket pockets. He didn't have the key for the Yamaha. He pulled a pair of Knipex pliers from his back pocket, stripped the ignition wires with his teeth, and twisted the copper threads together. The dashboard flickered to life. Suddenly, a massive spotlight swept across the boneyard, illuminating the rusted chassis of dead cars. Over the roar of the party, Leo heard the furious, unmistakable roar of heavy V-twin engines firing up. Bear had recovered. "There he is!" a voice yelled from the edge of the scrap heap. 2 heavy Harley-Davidson Diner Street Bobs, ridden by Bear's enforcers, Griff and Maddox, smashed through a stack of wooden pallets, their headlights pinning Leo against the fence. Bear rode behind them on a massive, blacked-out road glide. Leo threw his leg over the Yamaha and kicked the starter with everything he had. The 2-stroke engine shrieked to life, a high-pitched, aggressive wail that sounded like a chainsaw tearing through metal. He dropped the clutch, the rear knobby tire biting hard into the dirt, kicking up a massive roost of sand. He aimed the Yamaha directly at a weak section of corrugated tin fencing at the back of the lot. He hit the fence at 40 miles an hour, smashing through the rusted metal and launching out into the pitch-black void of the open Mojave Desert. The chase was on. The 3 heavy Harleys roared through the breach right behind him. The desert night was instantly illuminated by their blazing halogen headlights. Leo pushed the Yamaha to its absolute limit. He was riding blind, relying solely on the faint moonlight reflecting off the pale alkali dust. He heard the thunder of the Harleys closing in. On a paved highway, the massive 110 cubic-inch engines would run him down in seconds. But out here, in the deep sand and jagged rocks, weight was the enemy. Leo veered sharply to the right, aiming for a treacherous, dried-out riverbed known as a sand wash. He dropped a gear and pinned the throttle, the lightweight dirt bike skimming violently over the deep, loose sand. Behind him, Griff and Maddox tried to follow. The heavy front ends of their custom Harleys immediately ploughed into the deep sand. Griff's front tire washed out, sending the 700-pound motorcycle violently tumbling end over end into the dark, launching the Enforcer over the handlebars. Bear, furious, refused to yield. He kept his road glide on the harder-packed ridge above the wash, paralleling Leo's path, pacing him in the dark. Bear pulled a heavy, matte black revolver from his cut, taking one-handed shots into the dark. The cracks of gunfire echoed off the distant canyon walls, kicking up geysers of sand inches from Leo's tires. Leo needed to end this. Up ahead, he saw the jagged silhouette of a narrow slot canyon, a fissure in the rock face carved by flash floods. It was barely wide enough for a horse, let alone a heavily modified touring motorcycle. Leo aimed the Yamaha directly at the black crack in the earth. He hit the rocky incline, the dirt bike's suspension soaking up the punishing boulders. He slipped into the narrow canyon, the rock walls instantly scraping the sides of his boots. Bear, blinded by rage and adrenaline, realized too late that his road glide was too wide for the gap. He slammed on the brakes, locking up the rear tire, but the momentum was too great. The heavy cruiser smashed violently into the solid granite wall of the canyon entrance. Metal shrieked, fiberglass shattered, and the desert fell suddenly, terrifyingly silent behind him. Leo didn't look back. He kept the throttle pinned, navigating the twisting, claustrophobic canyon until he burst out the other side. Miles later, the rugged desert terrain gave way to cracked asphalt. Leo rolled to a stop at the edge of the legendary Route 66, entirely alone, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. The Yamaha idled beneath him, hot and smelling of burnt oil. He reached into his jacket, his trembling fingers brushing against the thick, solvent-soaked stacks of cash. Back at the iron summit, Dutch was pulling a small, greasy piece of metal out of his pocket, his eyes widening as he recognized the microscopic bare paw engraved on the side. The predator had become the prey. The cold desert wind whipped across Leo's face as the taillights of the heavy cruisers faded into the dusty abyss. He had $10,000 strapped to his chest and a battered Yamaha beneath him. The debt to Carmine Rossi was as good as paid. He wasn't just a scared runaway anymore. He was the mechanic who outsmarted the devil himself. The vast, open road stretched out, finally his own. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. In her trembling hands rested a single, slightly bruised turkey sandwich, her only lifeline in the freezing Reno rain. But when a guttural groan echoed from the pitch-black alley, 19-year-old Fiona had to make a choice: save herself or save a dying monster. The wind off the Sierra Nevadas didn't just blow through Reno, it hunted. It found every tear in 19-year-old Fiona Adams' thin denim jacket, biting into her ribs with the ferocity of a wild animal. It was mid-November, and the city's neon glow reflected off the rain-slicked pavement like shattered stained glass, offering light but absolutely no warmth. Fiona was a ghost in her own life. After aging out of a broken foster care system in Oregon, a string of bad luck, stolen backpacks, and predatory landlords had left her on the unforgiving streets of Nevada. For the past 3 days, her reality had been defined by a hollow, gnawing ache in her stomach that had slowly transitioned from sharp pain to a dizzying, terrifying numbness. But tonight, she had a miracle wrapped in crinkled foil. Tucked safely inside her jacket, pressed against her chest to keep it dry, was a thick turkey and Swiss sandwich. A sympathetic diner cook named Arthur had handed it to her through the back alley door of the Silver Spoon, just as they were locking up. "Get out of the rain, kid," he had muttered, slipping her the foil package. It felt as heavy as a gold brick. She had planned to take it to her makeshift shelter, a dry enclave behind the rusted loading docks of an abandoned textile warehouse, and savor every single bite. It was enough calories to keep her going for another 2 days if she rationed it. As Fiona hurried down the darkened industrial corridor of 4th Street, her worn canvas sneakers splashing through icy puddles, the rhythmic drumming of the rain was suddenly pierced by a sound that made her freeze. It was a heavy, wet cough, followed by the undeniable sound of a large body slumping against a brick wall. Every street instinct Fiona possessed screamed at her to keep walking. In this part of town, curiosity wasn't just dangerous, it was often fatal. But as she took a step forward, a jagged flash of lightning illuminated the narrow alleyway to her left. Lying in a pile of discarded wooden pallets and wet trash was a man. He wasn't just large, he was colossal, easily pushing 250 pounds of muscle and leather. Beside him lay a crushed, custom-built Harley-Davidson motorcycle, its front wheel bent at a grotesque angle, the headlight shattered. Fiona took a cautious step backward, ready to bolt, but the stench hit her then, the sharp, unmistakable copper tang of fresh blood mixing with the smell of spilled gasoline. Against her better judgment, Fiona crept closer, the shadows swallowing her. The man was clutching his lower abdomen, his massive, calloused fingers slick with dark crimson. He wore a heavy leather vest, the back of which she couldn't see, but the front bore a series of patches. The unmistakable red-on-white lettering spelled out Hell's Angels on the top rocker, with a Nevada patch sitting just below his shoulder. He was a patched member of the most notorious motorcycle club in the world, and he was dying. "Hey," Fiona whispered, her voice trembling. "Hey, are you okay?" The man's head snapped toward her. Even through the blood loss and the rain, his eyes were terrifying, pale, piercing blue, set deep into a scarred, weathered face. A jagged scar ran from his left ear down to his collarbone. "Get the hell away from me," he growled, though his voice lacked the booming authority it surely usually possessed. He coughed again, a wet, rattling sound, and his head rolled back against the wet brick. Fiona should have run. This was gang business. If whoever did this to him came back, she would be nothing but collateral damage. But as she watched his chest heave, struggling for air, she didn't see a terrifying biker. She saw a human being whose life was draining into the filthy Reno gutters. She dropped to her knees beside him, the cold puddle soaking instantly through her jeans. "You're bleeding out," she said, panic edging her voice. She reached out, hesitating before pressing her hands over his massive, blood-soaked ones on his abdomen. "Don't touch me," he snarled, trying to shove her away, but his arm was weak, trembling violently. "Stop fighting me," Fiona yelled back, surprised by her own sudden ferocity. "If you don't put pressure on this, you're going to die right here in the garbage." The biker blinked, seemingly shocked by the audacity of the scrawny, soaked teenager yelling at him. He stopped resisting. Fiona stripped off her only dry garment, a thick woolen scarf she had found at a donation bin, and pressed it hard against the deep laceration just above his hip. It looked like a knife wound, deep and jagged. "What's your name?" Fiona asked, trying to keep him awake as his eyes began to flutter. "Jim," he gritted out, his jaw clenched tight against the agonizing pain. "They call me Big Jim. Jim McCall." "Okay, Jim, I'm Fiona. You need an ambulance." "No cops," Jim wheezed, grabbing her wrist with a sudden, iron grip that made her gasp. "No, paramedics. Club handles its own. My brothers, they'll come." "How? Your phone?" Fiona looked around frantically. Jim nodded weakly toward his leather jacket pocket. Fiona reached in, her fingers slipping on his blood, and pulled out a heavy, shattered smartphone. The screen was completely destroyed from the crash. "It's dead," Fiona said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Jim, it's broken. I don't have a phone. I have to go get help." But as she tried to stand, Jim's massive frame began to convulse. It wasn't just the shivering from the cold or the blood loss. His skin turned an ashen, sickly grey, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead, mingling with the rain. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. "Jim? Jim!" Fiona shook his shoulder. His eyes rolled back. "Insulin," he mumbled, his words slurring so badly they were barely recognizable. "Crashed. Sugar. Dropping."